We want to provide an overview of the work that the Open Skills Network is doing, including some of the reasons around why we are doing this, what we're hoping to accomplish, and the progress that we've made so far today. So I am really thankful to have our group of panelists here today, and I'm going to let you introduce yourselves, let us know where you're from, and why you decided to join the Open Skills Network.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Dave McCool. I'm the President and CEO of Muzzy. We are in the online simulation space, using simulations to help develop and assess skills for students, both in kind of formal programs and also in non-traditional credentials. Been doing a lot of work with traditional publishers like McGraw-Hill, but more recently working with Education Design Lab to build simulations to assess 21st century skills and to try to make that a more efficient process. So for us, the OSN, as soon as I saw OSN, I'm like, oh, this is great, because everyone has their own taxonomy of these 21st century skills, and they're not very portable. So things like RSDs, rich skill descriptors, getting common definitions of critical thinking, creative problem solving, oral communication helps people who develop content around those skills make it be more portable and adoptable.
And hello everyone, I'm Jeanne Kitchens, Chief Technology Services Officer with Credential Engine, and the reason I'm involved with Open Skills Network is because as part of our mission, we believe that credential transparency and its linking into things like skills and competencies and work is critical to everyone. And so we developed a set of open technologies and a common language for describing credentials and skills and related information, and it's open for anyone to use. So we're fully vested in the Open Skills Network.
And hello everybody back there too. I'm Michael J, and I'm CEO of Matchmaker Education Labs, and no, we don't help people date better. We help align and dynamically look at the relationships between different parts of a learning environment, whether it's learning resources, competencies, certificates, credentials. So the ability to be able to say somebody brings a particular set of skills, what additional skills do they need to be able to fill a new area, and then what standards might they need to be addressing, and what resources could they use to learn that. So the ability to work dynamically between those. So that's it. And we joined OSN for obvious reasons, which is that the ability to be able to move dynamically between those is a critical component to really making these skills usable.
I'm Marni Stein. I'm Chief Academic Officer and Provost at Western Governors University, and thanks for inviting me last minute to be here. I'm so happy to be here. And I'm so happy to see you guys face to face, because I've met you all online. Jeanne, I met face to face, but I feel like I know you, but
Yeah.
It's just weird. It's like you're out of the box.
That's right. You have a body.
You have a body. It's so great to be here. And I'm was interested in the OSN just essentially because we're a competency-based university, and we have, every one of our programs is a stack of competencies that is really a cluster of skills. And a couple of years ago, we really doubled down on trying to figure out, this is great and it's wonderful for us, it's wonderful for our students in terms of how we build our programs, but how do we turn skills into more of a currency that's more commonly understood across different types of competency-based and skills-based education, as well as hiring. We knew it was going to take a village or more to get there, and so the OSN was a great way to convene all the different folks across the skills ecosystem to come and solve together.
Thank you. And I think that's a really great point, in that the Open Skills Network just started in September, and yet we already have over 1,000 members that has joined part of this coalition. This is across educational institutions, employers, workforce development, military, government, that are really here because we believe not just in skills, but in open skills, and to really be able to share those across the community to really drive forward the workforce and hiring and education movement, specifically around skills. We believe this is a huge piece to help solve equity challenges, as well as to really help the upskilling, reskilling, cross-skilling that employers need today to make sure that we are continuing to maintain a relevant workforce. So we're really excited with all of the progress that we've made to date, and really excited to be able to have this panel today. So I'm going to start with, and Marni, I'm sorry, I'm Sarah DeMark. Who am I? I am WGU's Vice President of Workforce Intelligence and Credential Integrity. I'm also the Interim Executive Director for the Open Skills Network. So I'll toss that in there too. But Marni, I'm going to start with you because you mentioned a new currency, and that's really what the skills movement is about. So can you talk a little bit about how education and the credit hour, which has been sort of the currency to date, isn't really meeting the needs of the future, and how you see skills sort of filling some of that gap? And then I'll let you guys all jump in too.
Yeah, so obviously the credit hour serves a very important function in higher education, which is measuring the length of time that a student has been in classroom, but more importantly, it's how we allocate faculty to classrooms during a term, and that's a very important administrative function of the credit hour as well. The problem with the credit hour is it doesn't really tell you much about exactly what a student learned or what they achieved or how they achieved it. And so when competency-based education sort of surfaced, whether it's in medical schools or health professions or at WGU, where every one of our programs is competency-based, our currency was the definition of skills and competencies and the assessment criteria for passing those competencies or achieving those competencies, which is awesome. That's incredibly descriptive. But what we found ourselves having to do over the last 25 years is then equate that to 1 credit hour, 2 credit hours, 3 credit hours. And that's actually a very depressing thing to do, by the way. But it had to be done in order for our achievements to be translatable and transferable to other academic achievements. And so, over time, where this has brought us is essentially, over the last couple of years, we decided, as I mentioned earlier, okay, that's great, we can translate this into credit hours, but what is the value? What is the actual value of these competencies and skills in the workplace without that proxy? And how do we express that value, and how do we get to a point where the way we express that value is commonplace and it's universal and it's shared with other universities or employers who are in the same game? And so that's where this idea of skills as a currency emerged. We need an alternate currency to express value to the credit hour that makes sense for competency-based education, that makes sense for employers, and that makes sense for students to better understand the value of what they're learning, even along the way to a degree.
So, we keep trying to sort of bend the metaphor to keep on trying to make it work. And the problem is that the nature of what work is and learning is and the nature of how all that takes place has just changed significantly. And to simply count the number of hours that somebody has spent doing something without any measures of whether they're competent in that or how does that fit makes no sense. And I think that we were lucky enough to have this COVID event take place in that it really has gotten us to rethink the nature of what learning is and what our educational institutions do. So, of course, the concept of OSN preceded that. But in fact, this really ended up being a really interesting inflection point in terms of changing the way we think about that. So we at Matchmaker are really interested in this because while we talk about the currency, we actually provide that kind of currency exchange, the ability to be able to take different skills and be able to show the relationship between those parts. And so while it would be ideal if everybody would adopt the same set of competencies, I think we all know it's unrealistic to think that institutions are just going to grab those. So I think bringing them together in a logical way and sharing them, and then it really just changes the way we think about how we account for learning.
Yeah, and of course, I'm going to come from the perspective of data. For competencies, skills and competencies to be currency, they have to be data. It has to be interoperable. It has to be searchable and discoverable on the web as well. And so that's where we come in at Credential Engine And for example, when I think about state articulation agreements with colleges, that probably every state has them, I would imagine, they're typically based on courses. And somewhere way behind that transfer value articulation where they all agree on how much credit may transfer, it's really based on a course, and buried in that information are, guess what? Skills and competencies or learning outcomes, but they're not data. And so that's really not part of the transaction for that articulation. So what we really need to see is this skill competency data surfaced as data that we can all reuse, and we can interchange that data to make it more meaningful, and then we can scale it using various applications of AI that can help make those interpretations. But until it's freed up from those hidden places, we're just going to have those scalability issues.
Yeah, I think for me, I think we'd probably all agree that the credit hour was always an imperfect proxy for learning. We all probably went to college, and we all knew we didn't all come out at the same place, even though we spent the same amount of time there. I think as post-secondary education has diversified and become more universal, it's become worse. If you're all 18 years old, coming from similar backgrounds, going through that experience, that's one thing. But if I'm 35 and ex-military and you're 18, like the time on task doesn't mean as much anymore. And certainly as an employer trying to hire, you're always looking for what can they do? Where's proof of something they can do? And new graduates are always challenging for that. So I think, lost my second thought. And I think the other dynamic is the technology advancement and the ability to search knowledge. So the knowledge versus skills trade-off when I need my first bit of education in my life, I think is very different than it was certainly than when I was in college. So this idea of moving towards skills and what can you actually do and show you can do authentically, I think is a huge, it's really important.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Michael, I'll start this question with you. So the skills-based future has tremendous potential for employers, individuals, labor markets, and for transforming education. But in some ways, it's a massive shift. What will it take for employers and education institutions to adopt skills, technology, and systems?
Yeah, it's there's a bit of a catch-22, and because the person who's hiring somebody needs to value that skill and see that as the useful piece, and then the institution needs to put their first. The question is which one needs to come first, and so people have often said it's a chicken and an egg issue, and I keep on saying we need to do things like OSN, which brings the rooster to that chicken and egg relationship. People seem to leave the rooster out. Have you noticed that? We really can affect that change. We can make that happen, but it really requires a concerted effort to put out that the skills are the basis of the learning, and really show that there's real value that's there, as opposed to this sort of fuzzy, fictitious sort of, I finished a course, well, what does that mean, sort of process. So I think that's what we need. Also, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but Jeanne and I were doing a session about sort of what was that? Not the skills. It was the what policy things need to happen to affect change. So we'll talk about that one later. Yes, right. Thank you.
Well, I think part of it is simply the tools and making things as simple as possible, right? And not having this perception that it's super complicated, and also understanding that yes, we're all here to talk about how important skills and competencies are in moving up and being more about that than maybe just the name of the school that you went to. On the one hand. On the other hand, of course, we have to balance that with other things. People have many other experiences in their lives, so we want to keep that humanistic element as well, and temper both, so we have both. And so I think that's important in our messaging. So when we're talking to employers and we're talking to education and training providers, we're not just saying, yeah, we know it's not just this one piece, that there's more to it, but we have to have those skills and competencies as data at the same time, so we can have the best of both worlds. So I don't know that I know the answer on how to.
We're going to figure it out together.
We need.
Well, I just want to throw in, not to be gloomy or a wet blanket, but I spent a good deal of time in my career sitting in a basement office as the person who oversaw accreditation and did all the learning outcomes and program outcomes workshops with faculty. and it wasn't pretty. I mean, the conversation around explicitly identifying learning outcomes in a course and then committing to assessing those and then surfacing that as an achievement in its own right outside of a course or a degree, that is a more radical mindset shift than you might think. It seems very practical, and why wouldn't you do it? Because it shows the students or students' parents or employers, hey, my French literature class actually prepares students with adaptive thinking or cross-cultural communication skills. You'd think that it's like just simple course branding that people would want to do. But there's a resistance there. And there's obviously a protected interest there that is going to be part of the shift ahead.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a trust, but do I have to verify question, right? If I have to verify, that's expensive. That's time consuming. So if I can trust the credential that I see, then that's great. Then I can sort of get past that much more quickly. And so it's accreditation. Who's accrediting these skills? I don't know. I've been on the OSN calls, and that's come up a few times, and I haven't heard an answer to that yet. But I think one trend that's helpful that we're seeing is that a lot more universities are putting skills outcomes directly in their course outcomes. So even if I'm just still in a bachelor's program and I'm not necessarily shifting out of credit hours yet, I'm going to graduate with some verified skills that are part of that. So maybe there's a bridge there. Maybe there's somehow that starts to build the trust in skills as a measure because it comes from somebody they already trust, and then you can somehow build out from that.
Yeah, I think the transparency is really key, and I think that's where a lot of the value of this work is coming from. So I think that's a really good call out. All right. Well, maybe Jeannie, we'll start with you on this one. Sure. The Open Skills Network exists to help organizations make the transition into a skills-based future, and importantly, to help organizations make that transition in a coordinated way, speaking a common language. Why is that shared language important? And as a special challenge to our panelists, can you answer without using the word interoperable?
Well, that's a mean question.
That really is, that's mean-spirited, I would say.
I'm not sure about that, but wow. You might have to backtrack a little.
All right. So how do we get through this shared language, and why is that really important to driving this work?
So right, we talk about that a lot. You know, I say this and I mean something specific, but maybe to you it means something very different. And then I think about, but really even in the U.S. there's so many dialects and languages spoke here that when I think about it, I don't really like to think of it as a common language, and I even have a tough time myself thinking about it as a translation, but I do understand all those, you know, wants and needs to be able to do that. So I think what we have to be able to do is take, you know, what I say and what you say and be able to, you know, Rosetta Stone? Okay, that does mean translation, doesn't it? You know, to have that common understanding. I don't foresee it being that everybody's going to use the same exact words, just like we don't do it now, even here, you know, in this very city. So, but we have to advance the tools that will help with that and allow for that scalability. And as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of that is going to be AI driven. I know there's a lot of work going on in that area now. I'm working on a couple of projects where that's not my area of specialty, the AI part of it, but we're having a lot of success on doing that, on being able to extract skills and competency statements that are accurate and put side by side with how a human would write it, and then being able to align them and have an alignment and understand, well, what is that alignment and what does it mean, and is that alignment what you can offer me in training, and as an employer, what I say I need, is that alignment pairing up or not? So I think there's a lot of work to be done on that, but I also think there's a huge opportunity there and a lot of work going on in that area.
And I do want to chime in because it's although AI is going to play an important role on this, we can't lose the human aspect of that as well.
No.
Right, exactly.
Human-centered, yeah.
And AI has a normalizing effect. It tends to sort of find that relationship where there's commonality. In fact, it's really important as we're working on competencies and standards and the like that we capture the bias that's there, because the bias is often the essence of the intent. And so I think that's one of the challenges that's before us as a community, is to figure out how best to do that.
Yeah, it's a whole other topic.
Yes,
Bias.
whole nother topic.
Anybody else want to add to that?
I would say for us, it's funny because we're sort of more on the supply side, like we're helping people build skills-based content to push into the ecosystem, not so much on the credentialing and the other side. And I think it's discoverability. So I think that translation is a good word. I'm sitting here thinking, okay, we're helping EDL build a bunch of content mapped to their taxonomy, and we already heard several other ones through the OSN network. Can RSDs be a way to translate between those so that if someone's looking for, I really need some skills-based practice for my students, and then I really would like a skills-based capstone, how do I find that, right? Because I don't want to have to search 2 million credentials to see which ones might make sense. So I hope OSN can help put that translation in place.
I guess the only thing that I would add is just for the audience is that when you go out to look for skills, they're either buried deeply in documents. Like one time we did a project, this was years ago, looking at nursing skills, and we unearthed all of these Word documents and PDFs from boards of nurses all across the country in every state, and then we had to manually get all that skills data and put it in a Excel file. And you could literally, when you saw these skills statements, you could almost recognize the different authors by style, because the style of the writing for each of the skill was so different. So it's either that exercise, or you get some of these open taxonomies, which are great, but the skills are like communication or writing or speaking, or, they're so high level in one word that they have no context to them at all. So the question becomes, it's been incredibly manual to get rich skills descriptions, which actually create a description of a skill that is contextualized to a particular sector or job role or type of application. The question becomes what's the balance over time going to be between sort of the manual description of these skills, going out and working with employers who often haven't described the skills well themselves in their job descriptions or in their workforce competencies or whatever, or AI, or both, and I think it's both, and that's part of what we're trying to do with Open Skills Network. Is we've been stuck between this horrible archaeological dig to try to figure out what the skills are that's very labor intensive, and the minute you do it, the minute you drive it off the lot, it's devalued, right? And AI scraping, that's great, but it's just only as good as the skills data that's out there, and oftentimes ends up just being a list of one-word skill descriptors that you probably could have just guessed.
Yeah.
Right?
Is that a segue to contextualization?
I think so.
Oh, there we go.
Is that?
But I didn't use the I word.
No.
Well, skills-based hiring and education, it's been around for a while, right? This isn't new language, but we're really starting to see the momentum pick up. We're especially seeing over the last year interest in federal and state governments as well. So as we start to see growth of OSN and interest from governors and skills and interest from various sectors of the federal government, why is this happening now?
Anybody? Well, I think, we're watching the news, we know the politics, we know all the issues, we've all come out, hopefully the other side of COVID, which has really, shined a light on all the issues that we already all knew were there. And it's very unfortunate that it has to happen that way, but I just sat down there listening to all the, the main speaker panels talking about, the road ahead, the investments that are going into this, the policy changes that are going into this. It's a necessary, it's finally reached a point, I think, where it's just simply a necessity at the policy and legislative levels. So it's a bad, misfortunate how it's occurred. But we need it, so bring on the funding and bring on the policies and bring on the legislation.
So probably a little heretical depending on who you are. I mean, increasingly learners are able to go elsewhere to get educated.
Right.
They find a lot of other places, and the piece of paper they get out of an institution doesn't bear the value that it once did. And the institution has to rethink how it works and what it does. And I think the expectations by the learners is changing as well. They want to make sure that there's something tangible, something that's measurable, something that an employer actually sees and values, and it's not just getting a certificate from an Ivy League institution or the like. So I think that's part of that major shift that's pushed us over that point at this right now.
Yeah, and I think related to that, we're seeing so many states as well as cities and zip codes where we're seeing fast-growing populations of individuals who live in those areas that do not have access to education and do not have the credentials that they need to work in the very industries that those states and those cities are trying to bring in. So you see there's this rising group of people who do not have access, and then you have all these industries that are requiring certain credentials, and it just creates this incredible gap. And what do you do about that gap? Do you import talent from another city or another state? Or do you double down on very urgently getting a big percentage of the population to a credential that will allow them employment in the industries that you're trying to encourage? And you just can't wait 4 years or 6 years or 8 years to do that. You need to fix that now, not only for your city or for your state, but for the well-being of the people who live there. So I think that's happening and becoming more and more obvious as well.
I think, I don't know the answer, but I have two thoughts on this. It's the why now question. I think that the work that WGU and others have done, I've seen it in the 20 years I've been in education, this slowly rising awareness that's generated. And then in the last 5 years or so, the whole, the jobs of the future aren't the jobs that exist today. So that was another ratchet up. Maybe COVID, which has a massive workforce dislocation step function, pushes it over the edge. Maybe this is the tipping point. But I think the other piece of it is that to then go fix that problem as a learner. 20 years ago, if you didn't need to go back to college because you already had the skills, but you had to get the job, you could do that without a whole lot of risk. I don't know who would do that today. $250,000 for a bachelor's for skills I'm pretty sure I already have, and wasn't a great student, so maybe I'm going to flunk out after 2 years and $100,000. It's not a viable path. So I think people get stuck.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I'm going to take the last few minutes of our session and open it up to our audience. Are there any questions? And because we are recording this, if you just raise your hand, we'll come over with a mic.
So mapping the skills seems to me to be the first and in some ways maybe the hardest part of the battle. But there also seems to be embedded in the idea of shifting from CUs to skills, the validation of those skills. To what extent do these things that the Open Skills Network is doing embed a better validation of the actual skills than what we've traditionally had?
Yeah, that is a big piece of the metadata that is associated with the skills and the conversation about as we're understanding skills, are we understanding individual skills? Are we really looking to understand traverses of skills toward mastery? And how do we distinguish those both in the description of the skills as well as metadata around how they're assessed? And my favorite example is the suture example, where suturing is a kind of skill that can be described, but there are context and level of mastery for suturing that have to do with, I can suture on I don't know if they suture on pigs anymore, but let's imagine they do. I can suture a pig, I can suture an individual human while somebody is right there with me, guiding me. I can do that in a controlled environment without somebody guiding me. I can do that on a battlefield with bullets whizzing through across across the event. And so there's all kinds of context there. You know, how am I suturing? With what am I suturing? Where am I suturing? In what context am I suturing? Is somebody there helping me or not? Am I stressed while I'm doing it? These are all levels of mastery that imply some sort of assessment for verification. That is a big part of the discussion, not only in the Open Skills Network, but in competency-based education generally, because it is about assessment and validation.
And with that, you know, this, of course, metadata. It has to be data. And metadata for me means that it needs to be human and machine readable, and that we're using properties or terms or descriptors so we know what that data means. It is defined. So you can have your skill statement written in whatever grammar, but I'm talking about the metadata that goes along with it to say it's in these environmental conditions,
Yeah.
you know, the hazards, the
Yeah.
level of proficiency, all those kinds of things can be part of that as metadata. And that's what's like locked up now. It's all there somewhere in systems because, you know, people have to be able to do these things, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a matter of unlocking all those locked file cabinets and start using that as metadata.
Yeah.
And the OSN is not intended to be the sole solution. I mean, your question involves a lot of other pieces. There are groups like the IEEE Learning Technologies Standards Committee that has a lot of different interesting kinds of way to gather other information that complements the work within OSN. So I think there's a larger movement taking place around gathering data, making sense out of data, so that we can then do assessments that capture the context and can provide some sort of accreditation of that individual within a particular context and move that around. So.
Yeah. And I would disagree with the whole context and level of mastery question, which is a big part of, you know, if I want to know what skill you have, I want to answer those questions probably as well. And how do we do that in a scalable way?
Yep.
Thank you guys for having this conversation. So there's a lot of really positive potential from a skills-based future, especially around sort of equity and kind of creating more pathways into opportunity. But there's also sometimes unforeseen consequences from large piles of data, like we see with social media and that kind of thing. So what's the role of government? What's the role of industry players? What's the role of the OSN in sort of making the skills-based future a utopia and not a dystopia?
So, yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I just mentioned the IEEE LTSC. I mean, there's groups within that are looking at who owns that data, how are those data used, and so again, the answer may not come from OSN, but in fact, it comes from the affiliated organizations that, I mean, it's amazing when I get on meetings, whether it's IEEE, OSN, or any number of others, sees a lot of the same faces. So we have a lot of different contexts, and we're really thinking about those issues. Recognizing that this kind of big data is the only thing that's going to get us to that point, but also recognizing that it's about the individual owning their data and how we use those data. And so these conversations are not devoid of that important issue.
Yeah, for sure. And we also need to remember that I guess the other slippery slope that I worry about with skills is it does have the potential to democratize the playing field, to recognize people for the skills they have, not their ability to afford $53,000 a year in tuition to go to the highest brand school that's going to get them the biggest. So it definitely has that opportunity, but what it doesn't change is the fact that people still need to get the skills and recognize that they have the skills and understand the value of the skills and be able to own them and share them with employers or other educational institutions. And so that's not just going to happen by magic. Just because skills exist doesn't mean people are going to know they have them. There's still a lot of work to do in terms of the provider space and the policy space to make sure that that skills-based education isn't for the people who are already advantaged, but it's for everyone.
Yeah, that's kind of the default, isn't it? Usually,
Yeah.
anything new comes along, it goes to the already advantaged first.
Yes.
Right.
And I think Marni said earlier, transparency, I think, is a big part. I sort of took the question, I think, differently than Michael took it, as more of how do we make sure diversity, equity, inclusion, how do we make sure these are fair for everybody? And I think if they're black boxes, as a lot of adaptive learning is accused of being these days, it's really hard to know if that's true or not. And then it probably does depend on who made them, and
Yeah.
we kind of know what that probably is.
That's right.
So I think the transparency of what's behind these assessments, what's behind this adaptive behavior, what's behind what you were actually shown to do and how you were doing it is important.
And then just in regards to the big heap of potential data that could come out of this, it's not necessarily always about the quantity, but the quality, right? So we do want some quantity out there, more than we have now, that's for sure. But we don't want it to end up then with basically an impression that, oh, this data isn't any good, this is not, this isn't really usable, or whatever the reason is for thinking there's a lack of quality in what comes out of the data. So whether it's the learner being able to control their own information, and those of us who are creators of skill and competencies and all of the data, the metadata that comes along with it, I think we have to be careful that it's, there's some kind of quality there, and that's probably a whole other discussion on how to agree on the quality.
Yeah.
Well, and the quality of the validator
Yeah.
of the skills, I think, is incredibly important as well.
At Matchmaker, our tagline is liberate learning. And I do think that the OSN and the effort here goes a long way toward liberating learning, and in a variety of different ways. You can take that as you see fit. But I think it's an important direction we need to take, and we need to learn from the past and hopefully architect this all so that we don't cause the problems we've had in the past.
Any other questions?
Ask for answers.
Yeah. Anybody have any answers?
Yeah. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left. I guess I'll end maybe with, I know you, many of the people on this panel, actually all of you, have sort of rolled up your sleeves and been able to do work with the rich skills descriptors and our open skills management tool sets. And how do you see this evolving, and where do you see this going over the next few years?
Well, first, one of the things we didn't really get into when we were talking about the rich skill descriptors so far is we haven't really talked about what we mean by the contextualization. And that really meaning giving that, whatever that skill or competency statement is, the validation, I guess, contextualization can mean a lot of different things. I mean, if a skill is associated with a credential, then that's a contextualization. But we also have contextualizations that skill statement are kind of pointing out to in the world, to basically give it weight, give it importance, as a validator of that skill statement. So, and again, I'm going to come from the metadata perspective. We have to have that as linked open data, and wherever possible on the web for search and discoverability. So, from my perspective, one of the important parts is to be able to learn about the contextualization, and to be able to basically map that to our schema. And now we have a task group, actually, that we have probably over 100 people on that group putting in input to additional terms in our schema for things that are contextualizations. And so this is a thinking that is recent. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and it was always the other way around, things pointing to that, and now we're talking about it in the other direction. So, I mean, I think that there's definitely a lot of momentum here in this area now.
Yeah.
So.
I think I want to go back to one of the terms that was used earlier, which is the concept of translation. I don't know if any of you use Google Translate, but I've used it and sent a note to somebody in Portugal who said, please never send me a note that was translated that way. And, it was probably a perfectly good translation, but what it missed was what I was trying to share. And I think that's really where our challenge lies ahead of us, is really the ability to be able to share conceptually what it is that we're trying to share. And that's going to allow us to be able to then traverse a lot of different workplaces and really take advantage of skills that people have learned in those different contexts.
Yeah, I would say it seems like the need is undeniable. I mean, the discussion around employers want to know what their potential hires can do, especially new students coming out or students coming from non-traditional backgrounds. And I think the landscape of trying to do that is kind of a mess right now. OSN is seems to be an attempt to try to put some structure and order around that, but like, should there be context? What does context mean? Mastery, how does that fit in? Granularity, like everybody's granularity of credential is completely different. So as an employer, I think it'd be really difficult to use what's out there. So I think if it can get some order on those, at least make it digestible, that would be a good step forward.
Right.
Well, my dream is just that someday, hopefully soon, that if I just as social media and the interwebs understand me perfectly in terms of my shoe buying behavior and serve me up at just the right time the pair of shoes that I need, right? I would like the same to be true against my skill profile, that I would understand and others would understand the value of my current skills and credential profile in the zip code where I live or I want to live, and that it could be surfacing insights to me about what I'm qualified to do, and surfacing windows to me that I otherwise would have never had. That's the dream, and that's where the real democratization comes in, is that every one of us has a value in the workplace or the work ecosystem where we live, but we often can't see it. We have no idea what it is. And I think that's the potential here that could change everything, change the world.
I like the analogy.
Yeah, nice.
You relate,
I
right?
would, yes. Based on where I was going. I want the shoes. So as maybe my last question to kind of wrap up is, there's a lot of interest in the work that we're doing. We're getting more members joining literally every day, which is fantastic and incredibly exciting. But what advice would you give to an organization that is wanting to embark on this skills journey?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, we had how many pilot programs? 17 of them?
14.
14? I can't keep track.
175 participants.
Okay, and so, I would say get in touch with one of them. Get an idea about what is it that they did, how did it work, what were their goals, what were the groups that they were working with. I mean, it's really, in the past we could just talk about it theoretically. Now we can actually get some nice tangible examples of how it's being applied. So it's a great place to start.
And I'll just put in a plug. If you go on the openskillsnetwork.org website, there is a list of all the pilot teams and the work that they were doing and the coalitions that were part of that. So thank you.
Yeah, and just start asking questions, and talking to members of the OSN. I think we're all in this to help each other. So I think we have a lot of willing people who would love to be able to, share information and work together on solving this.
Any other last thoughts?
I would second get involved.
Yeah.
I think it's a
involved.
great opportunity for employers. I think employers thinking about trying to help do outcomes on old credit-based accredited courses probably felt disconnected from what they do every day. I think they know what they want. They know what skills they want. So if they're
Right.
involved in the process, they'll get them.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I will mention, as we're shifting out of this summer, we are going to be focusing on helping different organizations with those adoption strategies, with best practices, tool sets. There is a lot of change management that goes behind this to get organizational adoption. So we will be putting together communities of practice that can come together and help each other either technically or problem solving and so forth. So there's a lot more exciting work to come. So if you have not joined, please join. And we look forward to having more conversations. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much
Thank you.
to the panel. This was a great discussion. And thanks, Marni. She was Sharon Liu had a flight cancellation and was unable to attend today. So thank you for jumping in last minute.
No problem.